All right, guys. So it's now two. Let's just kick this off. I think we have more people registered for the event, so I'm sure they'll come in as time goes by. So welcome everyone. Thank you so much for coming. My name's Eric Zhao. I'm from Indiana University. And together with my co-organizer, Joanna Lee, we welcome you to our PDW Optimal Distinctiveness. So thank you so much for joining us today. So if you have been following this PDW, you know that I have been organizing this PDW since 2017. So this year's PDW is the fourth time we have gathered at the Academy to discuss optimal distinctiveness. For those of you who have been with us since the genesis of this PDW, thank you so much for your continuous interest and support. And for those of you who join us for the first time, welcome to this community. As an organizer, I'll spend the next few minutes to give you a very brief introduction to this topic and walk you through a few key logistic issues. And then we'll launch the first panel discussion. All right. Now, let me start with a very quick definition. I think this might be particularly important and useful for the first comers, right? So what is optimal distinctiveness? OD is defined as a dynamic process whereby organizations identify and orchestrate various types of strategic resources and actions to reconcile the conformity versus differentiation tension in order to succeed in multi-level and dynamic environments. So OD research is strongly rooted in several foundational theories, including the micro perspectives of OD, strategic balance theory, cultural entrepreneurship, as well as research on categories and computation. Building on these theoretical foundations, Greg Fisher, Mike Lonsbury, Danny Miller, and myself, we published this review and conceptual piece trying to synthesize and re-energize optimal distinctiveness conversation. So over the past few years, this topic has gained traction and opened up a lot of opportunities for scholars, especially for research at the intersection of strategic management and organization theory, but also for research in entrepreneurship and international business. Indeed, since the publication of this 2017 SMJ article, we have accumulated a large body of OD research centered around 4 core ideas. So the first key idea here is the multidimensionality of OD, contextual contingencies of OD, temporal dynamics of OD, and benchmarks for gauging OD, right? So a lot of studies here were done by our panelists, in fact, and I'm sure they will expand on these ideas in subsequent panel discussion, as well as a breakout room conversations. So what is most satisfying for me is that the progress we have made in recent years has been mainly driven by doctoral students and junior faculty, so which is very encouraging. Now, to further build the community and facilitate the conversation, like I mentioned, I have organized this PDW for 4 times since 2017. As you can see, some of the panelists have been with us since the very beginning. So we thank all of our panelists who have contributed to its success. And this year we have another very distinguished panel. For the sake of time, I will not introduce them one by one. They really need no introduction, but instead I'll just walk you through our agenda very quickly, okay? Now, right after my introduction, we will launch the first panel discussion. We have 5 distinguished speakers. Each of them will talk for about 10 minutes. We will start with Marianne, who will talk about the theoretical foundation and historical development of OD research. Rudy will discuss some foundational assumptions of OD research, focusing on the notion of optimality. And then we have Gino, who is going to touch upon the promises and challenges of OD research using the Italian opera sector as an example. And Per cannot be here with us today, but he did send us a video recording discussing both OD at the category level, as well as some methodological issues related to QCA. And finally, we'll have Nelson, who will discuss qualitative approaches to OD research. So all very exciting topics. I definitely look forward to hearing their presentations. I hope you too. And note that you do have about 20 minutes to ask our panelists questions and share your thoughts after their presentations. So please feel free to leave your questions and comments in the chat box as we hear our speakers' presentations, all right? Now, after this first panel discussion, we will open 7 breakout rooms anchored by our panelists. Each room will be labeled with a provisional topic, and we'll let you self-select into these different rooms based on your interests. This will be about 45 minutes. And after this 45 minutes breakout room discussion, we'll reconvene in the main room, and we'll hear 7 inspiring colleagues talk about their research on OD, covering both theoretical and empirical fronts. Each of them will talk for about 5 minutes, followed by a 15-minute Q&A at the end. So please do stay with us until the end of the PDW if you can, as this second panel discussion is infused with some very exciting, very contemporary ideas related to OD. All right, now, so that's basically today's agenda, and I hope all of you will have a pleasant and productive experience. Thank you very much again for being with us. And now let me pass this over to Marianne, and who will talk about theoretical foundation and historical development of OD research, right? So let me stop sharing, and
thank you, Eric.
Over to you, Marianne. Yeah.
Let me boot it up.
Sure.
Okay, are we good to go?
Yeah, looks good.
All right. I'm really happy to be here. Thank you, Eric and Joanna, and thank you everyone for coming. Today I'm going to talk about OD's theoretical foundations in historical development, and it's based on a paper that Eric and I have been working on for a bit. So thank you, Eric, for contributing to this as well. So we start at the beginning. Okay, for some reason it's not, there we go. As you all know, it started in the realm of psychological theory at the individual level of analysis. It was primarily the work of Marilyn Brewer, who brought to light this idea that of optimal distinctiveness, and she labeled it just that way. And she talked about how social identity speaks to this fundamental tension. So from the beginning, we've been talking about tension, contradictions, other kinds of conflict between these two dimensions, which she calls at the individual level, similarity to others, and also the need for uniqueness and individuation. David Deephouse, who's here, thanks David, brought us to brought it to the organizational literature with his strategic balance theory. Again, we see this tension or trade-off, as he called it, between now conforming and differentiating, and the need to be as different as legitimately possible in org strategies. And so thus began this idea of needing balance between these two dimensions. And it's a site where org theory meets strategy. So I think it's very exciting, and it's got a lot of promise. On the organization theory side, it anchors sameness. And this is largely just derived from institutional theory, where we know isomorphism or conformity to the prevailing institutional template breeds legitimacy, which in turn enables wealth creation. On the other side, we know that strategy anchors differentiation, such that competitive difference breeds advantage in the marketplace so that firms can succeed. But one of the issues here is that this is being cast in very, very broad brushstrokes. Sorry, I don't know what's with me today, broad strokes, that it's kind of hard to begin to think about how optimal distinctiveness operates at this level that it does between these two dimensions and the tensions that they have. So Eric and I were conceptualizing optimal distinctiveness kind of as a guardrail, if you will, where there's a strategic push towards differentiation. The needs for conformity and legitimation give you a sense of guardrails to hem it in and make organizations legitimate. And so the question becomes, how does this happen? How does this function? So we came up with this idea that there are contextual contingencies attending optimal distinctiveness. These are not exclusive by any means. They are not definitive by any means, but they are provocations for ways of thinking about optimal distinctiveness that may expand our horizon. And they are organizational hybridity, societal culture, and temporal contingencies. And I'll just speak a little to each one in turn, hopefully to stimulate your thinking and to advance a couple of questions. So OD and organizational hybridity. This originated in the organizational identity literature, and notably the work of Albert and Wetton, who claim that a hybrid organization is composed of two or more types that would normally not be expected to go together. So again, we have this tension that types that don't go together and that they are two or more. A lot of the literature on hybrids looks at the distinction between economic and social ambitions of organizations and how they come together in different ways to balance one or the other. And we know it's a tricky dance. And so we've seen that these hybrid elements can be positioned in different ways. Sorry, Albert and Wetton talked about how they may be ideographic or separated across organizational departments. And this is what I found in my study of the orchestra, where you had the musicians and the administrators at odds with each other about what should happen, especially over financial considerations. Or they can be holographic in that they're held jointly within a department or an individual. And this is Karen Golden-Biddle and Huggy Rao's study that looked at a healthcare organization that such that each member on the board carried both identities and tried to navigate between them. So one interesting thing is to think about, where does this distinction reside in an organization? Is it ideographic or holographic? Another thought is, more broadly, we can think about what happens in the organization environment. The identity literature is largely focused within organizations. How are these tensions managed? The org environment takes us to institutional theory, which looks at how does the institutionalization of hybrid forms act as a touchstone for these judgments of sameness and distinction. We've seen more and more the prominence of different kinds of forms that can legitimate an organization as being one that encapsulates both its sameness and difference. So we were thinking perhaps this has changed the view of it as being so tension-ridden. So for future research, one thing we might consider is, could we conceptualize OD in terms of a hybrid organizational identity, and one that is increasingly institutionalized in the field and thus less conflictual for the organization on the ground? Another way we can begin to think about the contingencies affecting OD is to think about it in its societal context. Eric did this great work that looked at where were these studies conducted, what kinds of countries or environments, and overwhelmingly you can see that they were in the USA. It's a bar on the far left. So it begs the question of conformity or differentiation as some preferences that might be embedded in the societies, cultures, and in the industries and organizations. We know that individuals in different cultures have tendencies to emphasize either interdependence or interdependence or independence. So might we not see something similar at the country level? So our question would be, to what extent is OD culturally generalizable? Have we anchored too much on the US situation, which tends to emphasize individuality and tends to problematize it when other kinds of collective orientations are at play? So how do the polarities and dynamics of OD vary across different countries or different societies? And finally, our third contingency of the day is a temporal one. And so we've been seeing that there's been a movement away from static models of OD that at a moment in time encapsulate how an organization is dealing with conformity or differentiation, to more dynamic ones that might account for the environment in which the organization is embedded. This naturally brings up a question of, how do we move from perhaps a strategy that emphasized conformity to one that emphasized differentiation, and back again as it goes. So in a nascent industry, with Chad Navis, we found that nascent firms first emphasized conformity and then differentiation. They were building a new market category, and so it was important to conceptualize the category as a whole, and less important early on to differentiate themselves. However, once the category was legitimated, they moved to strategic differentiation. However, there's other work that suggests that being distinct is more important for new firms than for mature organizations. So we have a really nice dilemma in the literature that begs for future scholars to resolve it. At what point does industry stage or market category development affect pressures for conformity or differentiation? So there's also another study by Zhao and his colleagues that talks about new entrants in video game market and this idea of proto-category emergence. So again, accounting for these temporal contingencies would invite a more dynamic approach and also an understanding of what triggers may motivate OD shifts from one pole to another. So our question becomes, can we model OD more explicitly as a dynamic equilibrium, perhaps, that changes over time and in response to internal and external shifts? So to conclude, we were conceptualizing OD as a conceptual guardrail, enabling competitive differentiation, but hemming it in with conformity so as to endow an organization with legitimacy. And the functioning of this guardrail varies depending on contextual contingencies that have been largely unexplored and invite future research. The ones we've identified today anchor on organizational hybridity, societal culture, and temporal contingencies, but no doubt there are many, many more that are possible. So good luck to you as you hopefully begin to investigate this brave new frontier of OD research. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Marianne. Thank you so much for sharing. Now we're moving on to Rudy. Rudy is going to talk about some fundamental assumptions of OD research, focusing on the notion of optimality.
Excuse me 1 second. The glitch. Here we go. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yes, looks
Okay,
good.
fantastic. Eric, could you just notify me when I'm 2 minutes before 10 so that I
Sure, of course.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you. So it's a great pleasure to be with you once more for this PDW. Thank you, both of you, to have organized it. It's really a great pleasure. So I have basically one main focus in this short talk, and maybe this to whet people's appetite and reflections. And it's this. So we're talking about optimal distinctiveness, and most of the work we've been doing over the last 2 decades, or even a bit before, depending on which level we consider the topic, it has been on D. So do you differentiate too little, too much? Do you distinguish yourself, but still willing to belong to the group you belong? And we haven't questioned so much the O of for optimal or optimality. And so basically, what is optimal about OD? This will be the main question I will be commenting on. So if we take stock, so this is of course quite unfair taking stock summary, but what we have is that we know that optimal distinctiveness relates to such a sort of calculative positioning relative to an average from a field or an industry, or let's say a category system in which you are. And so basically you want to be distinctive enough, but not to lose some of the features and characteristics that make you still be part and identified as a member of a subgroup or a group. However, it's not always super clear what's the agency behind the outcome of being optimal distinctiveness. And the environment, because especially for the macro OD, when we are talking about firms or organizations, they not only try to position themselves related to the average or the prototype that you can find in their group, but they also want to change it. So it's strategic categorization, it's modifying the features, it's innovating. And so basically, we're just talking about optimal distinctiveness in a way that is ever-changing, and not ever-changing because of some macro characteristics of the system itself, but because of the actions of the agents. And so that makes the story very complicated, and hence why we are basically invoking the contingencies, and some of them you just presented, Marianne. And so I think, several of us think that there is a need for some complementary theorization. My take about it is based on, of course, my own research. So on category systems, for instance, but Eric or Richard or other pieces show that actually category system evolve, that the positioning relative to the category system make your distance change, and the outcomes of this distancing change as well. So this is for the, let's say, the more cognitive aspects of it, but there are also the psycho mechanisms that are included in the conformity. And actually, Eric, you presented the definition you have in the book that you penned. And here you use the term conformity. And when we say conformity, there is a normative aspect of it, an obligation, being part of the group. Matter a lot. And so why do you conform? Why not? Where does come the optimal nature of distinctiveness is really a question we have to ask. And so in a piece that actually we hope will be soon forthcoming in organization theory that we co-authored with Richard, with us today, we ask two questions, and this will be, I will be actually referring to this piece quite a bit. So we think we need to better understand the extent to which organizations actually optimize their distinctiveness, and investigate the conditions that enable or prevent organizations to optimize their distinctiveness. But the first question really is, do they actively optimize? Because you could be at the peak of the optimal distinctiveness, but not because of your own actions, but because of the actions of your rivals or the other members in the group. And therefore, the intentionality behind the OD literature is really under scrutiny. So, and especially we may ascribe too high levels of intention in suboptimal firms, basically the failed, and falsely attribute low performance to improper distinctiveness, even if the organization has no desire to be distinctive. So it's like with the literature on evolution or adaptation, that oftentimes we think and we ascribe intentionality for the firms or the entities that are adapted to their environment, but this could be random. This could be also the fact that it results from some other actors' actions on the environment that selects them. So here it's a bit of the same thing, and therefore, if we don't pay attention to this, basically we project or we overinterpret the results. Likewise, if suboptimal distinctiveness boils down to a lack of ability, so this time not an intention but an ability, then the practical recommendations emerging from our research may be especially limited, because basically the firms cannot be optimally distinctive because they don't have the ability to do so. Finally, if we conceptualize organization as being both willing and able to pursue optimal distinctiveness, but constrained due to local conditions, then whether one theorizes about development in distinctiveness within a given organization over time, or about differences between organizations occupying differently distinctive positions, fundamentally change what it means to be optimally distinctive. So let me stress a little bit more this point, because and we try with Richard just to represent it with this graph. So I'm not sure I will be able to give justice to this, but I think maybe you can have a flavor of what we think. So you see that here you have inverted U curves for each of the firms that are represented by black squares, sorry. And all of them are, in a sense, optimally distinctive regarding their own capacity and willingness to do it. But the difference between the left-hand panel and the right-hand panel is the comparison of within effects versus between effects. So in our theory, it's the right panel that predicts that a mid-level distinctiveness provides the firms with the highest performance, right? However, if we look within firms, we may observe that actually the shape, looking at the entire set of firms, might differ. And here we presented a U-curve instead of an inverted U-curve. So I think we need to be extra cautious, especially when we include fixed effects, firm fixed effects in our models, to really understand what we are doing and what it means when we compare within effects versus between effects. Because it may be the case that actually the comparability of the two effects is not so high, could differ. So then about the second question, what are the conditions that alter organization motivation and ability to optimize their distinctiveness? A bit like Marianne and Eric in their presentation, we are going over a few questions. The first one is what to optimize. Well, actually, we have an underlying assumption in OD that actually firms want to optimize their performance, right? So from David's 99 paper onward, most of the case, actually, what we're looking at, it's some sort of ROA or difference in ROAs or financial or accounting performance. It could be some cases different, like status or other things, but it's always related to some goal about performance. But what about the new trend? And I think it's more than a trend, with organization willing to perform on financial, but also environmental or social objectives. Then how does it change what to optimize? Second, where to optimize distinctiveness? Remember my first slide, so it's basically a category system. It can be genres, music genres, it can be food categories, it can be industry classifications. And so this is where we consider that firms look alike and basically refer to a prototype. But actually, we could imagine that actually where they want to optimize or the way they define their universe, their relevant universe for competing is not just the limited boundaries of the category system or the subcategories in which we put them, like boxes, basically. So would this change? So you see very well that if a firm, because it has a purpose, defines its purpose in a much broader way and differentiate and diversify its activities or want to optimize multiple dimensions, well, then by putting it back to the category system in which we can calculate the differences because it's more easy, it's easier for us, we may actually infringe some of their underlying assumptions about what is agency for this organization.
All right, Rudy, you have 2 more minutes.
Thank you very much. How to optimize distinctiveness? So here, most of the case, it's an alignment. It's a calculation of similarity of difference. And this is very limitative, we believe. So for instance, the paper by Richard in the SMJ or the former paper in AMJ with Pierre-Antoine Kremp, where we differentiated alignment from conventionality. Conventionality being the overrepresentation of some features that make me resemble and be identified as a member of a group. Is something very, very important. So I could be highly distant, so misaligned, but recognized as being part of a group because of some characteristic features that are overrepresented in the group I want to belong. Finally, optimal for whom? I think that this is also a very important question. For third parties like analysts, raters, or critics, for the buyer, for the owner of the firm, for the employees. So we don't pay too much attention to who is actually the final evaluator of that. And I think that we really need to work on disaggregating these audiences and contextualizing them better, identifying their capacities, accounting for more heterogeneity within audiences. And I know that in the second panel, we will be several people will be talking about that. And understanding their agency, their capacity actually to act on their valuation of the distinctiveness of this entity versus that other entity. And here, a paper I like very much is the paper by Anne Fleischer in 2009 about the conflict of interest that may change the valuation of the firm when the analysts have a conflict of interest. So that were some thoughts, food for thought, and I hope that actually it will be nurturing some interesting discussion further in the day. Thank you very much.
All right, that's excellent. Thank you so much, Rudy. It's great. So I think Gino is here. Gino, I'm so glad you made it.
Yeah, me too. Me too.
Yeah, so it's your turn.
Okay, great. Can you see slides, by the way?
Yeah, I can see it. It's good.
Wonderful. Let me put it in a slideshow. So first of all, thanks a lot for this invitation. I am very happy to be with you at last. I managed to overcome some entry barriers today. So thanks to the organizers. And actually, my presentation today will be very, very concrete. It's great that Rudy just presented, because some of the things that I will touch upon ties nicely with what Rudy was referring to towards the end of his presentation. So let me start with a very concrete example that originates from my recent work with Simone Ferriani and Giulia Cancellieri, a professional opera singer offline, on the opera industry. I think this is an interesting setting because the opera industry in Italy has been, as many of you probably know, one of the hotspots of opera. Is actually the cradle of Italy of opera as we know it. But the important thing here is that I want to emphasize is that in this context, like in many other contexts, there is a tension between conformity and innovation, pressure to preserve a revere tradition, therefore to conform to ritualistic ways of representing operas, but also pressure to innovate, to make opera not just a museum where you go and see over and over again the same type of performance, but a place where you can also see something that speaks to the younger generation. So this pressure to conform but also innovate has been a pressing need for opera houses. And actually our extensive field work has highlighted this as a key issue, a key challenge, if you wish, in the opera industry. So there are multiple ways through which opera houses can innovate. Two ways that have been described extensively by our interviewees are innovation through the reinterpretation of tradition. And this reinterpretation can take two different forms. One is what we call robust interpretation, where essentially when you reproduce an opera, you stage an opera, you are changing only peripheral aspects like visual staging or the temporal and spatial coordinates of the opera, but without changing its core features, basically the plot and the dramatic content, the script, sorry, and the dramatic content. Or you can actually be a little bit more, I would say, bold and change even in some cases the script and the dramatic content of the opera, in which case we are talking about radical interpretation. Let me give you, by the way, this has been a growing, there's growing evidence over the years that this reinterpretation, whether robust or radical interpretations, are becoming more and more important for opera houses, also in percentages of their overall productions over the years. So let me give you a very quick examples, and then I want to draw some general implications. So if you look at Madame Butterfly, you can have the original version situated in a particular time and space, but and then you have a robust interpretation where the script, the storyline is not changed, but you can see from this image the spatial and temporal coordinates are very different. This is the reaction of a critic that overall remains positive. By the way, this robust reinterpretation, if you wish, is an example of what we think is an illustration of optimal distinctiveness, in the sense you try to stick to conform to the tradition, but you try to differentiate your production without confusing, at least in principle, your target audience. Different story for radical interpretation. In this case, also the storyline, the script was changed, and this was clearly highlighted by one critic. So the expectations is that robust reinterpretation of the tradition should appeal more to audience members, as opposed to radical interpretation that can be confusing, difficult to process, and therefore make sense of, because they also defy existing categories, if you wish. And what we found empirically when we ran the analysis is actually something that is not fully consistent with the expectation. So the robust interpretation and the radical interpretation are both significant. So it seems that if you don't do something that I will talk about in a second, you don't really understand why what seems to be an optimally distinctive type of innovation is not different from a more radical reinterpretation. So our interviews clearly highlighted the importance of distinguishing between different types of opera goers. So the opera goers is not an homogeneous audience, but you can identify two main segments within this audience: seasonal ticket holders and single ticket holders. For reasons that I could elaborate on, but I hope you follow me on this in this respect. Season ticket holders are tend to be more conservative, although they are experienced opera goers. Single ticket holders, on the contrary, include a more heterogeneous group of individuals that don't necessarily go to the opera regularly, and therefore they might be more open to not even radical reinterpretation. Okay, this has been highlighted multiple times by our interviewees. And indeed, when you discriminate between the two groups, the two segments, we are talking about the same audience type. But one segment, season ticket holders, seem to be much more appreciative of robust interpretation than radical interpretation. And the opposite is true for single ticket holders that, on the contrary, on average, tend to appreciate radical reinterpretation more than robust reinterpretation. So this obviously raises, and I want to conclude quickly in a couple of slides, raises some interesting questions. I mean, many of you know that there is this growing attention on the role of different audiences and how the different audience members vary in their disposition towards either novelty and conformity, and therefore how you essentially resolve this tension between novelty and conformity pressures. But it's also, so this level of heterogeneity, of course, implies that there are different evaluative schemes, but these evaluative schemes or criteria don't necessarily vary across different audiences. They also vary across different segments of the same audience. Sometimes in the literature, in many studies that have also invoked the role of multiple audiences, the assumption, more or less explicitly, is that each audience type is internally homogeneous. On the contrary, and the marketing literature obviously has made this point very clearly for years, that even within the same audience type, you can identify different segments. Even among critics, you can have highbrow and lowbrow critics, for instance, and so on and so forth. Or even peers, some can be more bourgeois type or more avant-garde type, as Bourdieu would argue. So acknowledging these other sources of heterogeneity, not just across audience types, but also different segments of the same audience type, is, I think, an important consideration. So research on optimal distinctiveness argues that firms seek to resolve the tension between conformity and differentiation by adopting a moderate level of novelty for their products. The problem is that where you exactly draw that line not only varies across different audiences, but also across different segments of the same audience. So I don't have a suggested solution to this problem. I strongly believe that regardless of the context under investigation in this particular study, that a narrative approach might be an interesting way to go to resolve this tension of where to draw the line when you not only have multiple audiences, but also different segments within the same audience type that might require producers or candidates to resolve this tension differently, depending on the particular segment that they try to address. But this is clearly a tension that opera houses are fully aware of, and the evidence that I show you confirms that they have tried to address this issue by offering a mix of robust as radical interpretation, just to cater to both segments of the same audience type. I want to stop here, and I hope that in the breakout sessions we will go through some of these questions more deeply. Thank you so much.
It's very good, Gino. Thank you so much for sharing this very interesting study. As you can see, there's a lot of ideas which resonate with other speakers' points, right? Which is very good. Yeah. So now we are moving on to Pierre. Like I said, Pierre is traveling. Pierre is on the flight, but he did share with us a video recording. So I'm going to share Pierre's video recording with you guys right now. Okay. Gino, can you stop sharing so that I can?
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Are you absolutely right? Sorry about that.
No worries.
Sorry about that.
All right. So please let me know if you have difficulty hearing it, okay? I think it should be okay. Here we go.
Hello, my name is Pierre Fiss from the University of Southern California. Let me start by thanking John and Eric for organizing this symposium on optimal distinctiveness. And it's my pleasure to be part of it. Unfortunately, I can't be there in person as I'll be traveling on this day, but I wanted to take the opportunity to share some thoughts as the organizers had asked me to do, and specifically about, we're talking about optimal distinctiveness and the viability of categories. This is based on joint work with Jade Lowe, Eunice Rhee, and Mark Kennedy, and a piece that we published in the Academy of Management Review in 2020, entitled Category Viability, Balanced Levels of Coherence and Distinctiveness. And in this one, we argue that to remain in use, to remain viable, categories have to strike a balance between coherence and distinctiveness, using the concept of optimal distinctiveness here. So let me talk briefly about the dynamics of categories. Categories are, of course, fundamental to social and economic relations. They structure our experience, allow us to classify entities that we trade in or that we use in some shape or form. There's been a growing literature on categorization, and the themes in this prior work have been around the issue of the disciplining power of categories, that is, the ability of categories, for instance, to force actors to remain pure, in a sense, to remain within the category as opposed to engage in category spanning. But also the theme of how categories emerge has gained a fair bit of attention. Much less work has looked at how categories decline and disappear from usage. And in our article in AML, we wanted to
Hey, Eric, I can't hear the video.
Forces, which is something that Mark Kennedy and I had already suggested in 2013. Categories and classification systems is an accomplishment to be explained and not an automatic result of inertial forces, which is something that Mark Kennedy and I had already suggested in 2013. So we don't start with the assumption that category systems are stable, but rather that there's always change, always adjustment. And in our manuscript, especially, we take a relational perspective, and we develop a framework that aims to explain both the emergence and the decline and change of categories. Now, we look at two dimensions of category viability. Specifically, we suggest that to be viable, a category has to act both as a boundary marker and as a boundary object. As a boundary marker, the category sort of classifies and makes it clear what entities belong to a certain category. And as a boundary object, a category allows different actors to coordinate and meaningfully interact with each other around the idea of a category. So there's sort of a tension between these two, as you will see in a moment. And a viable category then has a balanced level of both category coherence and category distinctiveness. Let me briefly talk about those themes. Category coherence concerns is sort of an internal concept that relates to the relationship among the entities that make up the category. If a category has high coherence, it's easy to recognize it. It's easy to recognize the category as meaningful. But this high coherence may come at the cost of rendering the category somewhat rigid and narrow, because all the entities have to be rather coherent, and that can make it less useful for coordination. On the other hand, category distinctiveness is more externally oriented and relates to the overlap between a focal category and other categories that are somewhat adjacent to it. With high distinctiveness, the category is clearly distinct from the rest of the category system, but that also may represent a cost where the category becomes somewhat marginal and at the periphery. But on the other hand, a category that has a low degree of distinctiveness, and thus overlaps too much with adjacent categories, that may have less utility as a classificatory tool, because of course it is not so different from other related categories. Now, we use those two dimensions to develop a framework that has category distinctiveness ranging from low to high and category coherence ranging from low to high. And our argument is that, drawing on the notion of optimal distinctiveness, that at the center, at sort of intermediate levels of both coherence and distinctiveness, there is a zone of viability where categories are viable, where they're useful tools for classification that allow actors to meaningfully relate to one another. But as categories sort of drift out of this zone of viability and move towards the corners of this framework, they face various risks, and we'll briefly talk about those. For instance, a category that has low distinctiveness and low coherence sort of faces the risk of attenuation, where it becomes not very useful in making distinctions and has a lot of very different entities included. That means sort of it's more likely to fall out of use, as you see in more in TQM, where is some management concept that somewhat faced this kind of experience. On the other hand, sort of a category that has high distinctiveness but low coherence with very heterogeneous category members may face the risk of fragmentation and the breaking apart into different kind of categories. On the other hand, if you think about high coherence and low distinctiveness, categories here face the risk of absorption, of being absorbed into related categories, because they're not very distinct from these, but are very clearly understood, right? They have a high degree of coherence and thus may be more easily absorbed into other categories. And then lastly, categories that are both high in terms of their distinctiveness and coherence may face what we call the risk of isolation. That is, they may be very clearly defined and very distinct, but also often may become rather marginal to the category system and thus fall out of use for that reason. What we also illustrate in our paper is typical paths of category dynamics, if you will. For instance, a path to attenuation that was happened to TQM, a path to fragmentation where non-woven fabrics, the category of non-woven fabrics, broke apart into variety of other smaller subcategories because the overall category is less useful, and then a path to isolation and absorption. I also wanted to take this opportunity to talk briefly a little bit about, well, this is a conceptual framework, but some of the methodological issues around studying optimal distinctiveness. In terms of those methodological considerations, I wanted to suggest that there may be an opportunity here to move beyond standard linear methods and instead use a set analytic tool such as qualitative comparative analysis and fuzzy sets to study optimal distinctiveness. Let me explain the logic behind it, and particularly the notion of dual calibration. Dual calibration is the ability, or the calibration of measures, think raw data, into more than one crisp or fuzzy set. For instance, let's say we are interested in the question of life chances. And this is a question that Charles Reagan and I asked in our 2017 book, which was, is it more important to have rich parents, or is it enough and okay simply to have parents who are at least middle class, who are not poor, if you will? Now, in order to look at this, it's not so easy to do that with standard correlation methods. If you think about the slope of a variable, you can sort of see where the income distribution begins to flatten. But perhaps this might be a signal sort of where you are, whether it needs to be, you need to be rich or you need to be middle class. But at the same time, the linear model, while quite powerful, it is also very much biased in favor of linear relationships, which is, of course, not what optimal distinctiveness, for instance, would be about. And in any event, curvilinearity is always specification dependent. And that's sort of a bit of a now you see it, now you don't kind of situation. And lastly, there is, of course, the issue of multicollinearity if you were to create different measures, such as having rich parents, having not poor parents, or maybe having sort of middle income parents to use that. Now, if you switch from a linear model to a set analytic model and use fuzzy sets, for instance, here I'm showing you sort of two different ways of calibrating. One is membership in low parental income and high parental income. You could, in fact, sort of also create sort of a third membership, which would be membership in the set of those with medium parental income, which might have a membership function that follows sort of something like this, if you follow my cursor here, that goes across the middle, if you will. Now, the nice thing with an approach such as qualitative comparative analysis, you can in fact enter all three of these measures into your analysis. There is no, because QCA is not a method that uses correlations, there is no issue of multicollinearity here. So you could, for instance, create a measure of membership in those with intermediate values and use that as an antecedent for whatever outcome of interest you might be interested in. Now, I've used up about a good 10 minutes already, so it's time for me to wrap up. Again, my apologies for not being able to be there. I hope this may have sparked some, this may spark some future conversations. And I thank you very much.
All right, so many thanks to Pierre for sharing this video. We're going to move on to the next speaker, Nelson. Nelson will talk about qualitative approaches to OD research.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me okay, Eric?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Good. I don't have any slides. I'm not probably going to take, I'm going to try not to take my full 10 minutes. I'm kind of a fake on this panel because I'm not really an OD research person, but I've snuck in maybe on the coattails of Per, actually, because he was talking about some proposals for different research methods to use or to continue and develop and use further his QCA stuff. I want to talk a little bit about qualitative methods and why I think that the whole area of optimal distinctiveness might benefit from a more use. There's an opportunity, as Per said, an opportunity, I think, for more use of qualitative methods. And I'm also going to talk a little bit about social symbolic work, because I can never have an audience right now without talking about my book. So I'm going to tell you all about that. Per did it, so it must be okay, right? It's really nice to see everyone. Thanks very much to the organizers for inviting me. Some of you may have noticed that my institution has changed. It's a lie. I'm halfway between institutions. I'm in the UK, but I'm just about to join University of California at Santa Barbara very shortly. So some places my affiliation is one thing, some places my affiliation is another thing. Today is actually my first day of employment at UC at Santa Barbara. So yeah, it's great. Although I'm in Sussex, so it's a long story anyway. I want to start out with a little story, and it's a story that I was thinking about a lot as I was looking forward to this panel, and as I was thinking about what Eric asked me to do in terms of the panel. And a couple of years ago, we got a new dean at the business school at Imperial College, and he called me into his office and he said, "You're the strategy, you're one of the more senior strategy professors. I'd like you to be the chair of the task force to develop a new strategy for the business school." And that was the start of about a year-long adventure developing a new strategy for the business school, rethinking where we got into. And as I was thinking about that, it was basically an adventure in optimal distinctiveness. What I spent 1 year doing is refereeing between different groups of faculty. One group who said, we need to look like a business school, and one group that said, we need to be something really different. And basically that for a year, what we did is talk about that. And I had different faculty in my office in meetings, faculty meetings that we had, presenting different arguments to say, we need to be this, no, we need to be this. If we want students, we need to be distinctive. But if we want the university to support us, we need to look like a business school. And our conversation about the university, about the business school strategy was basically a conversation about optimal distinctiveness. Why am I telling you this story? Because I think when I think about the outcome of that is actually only a very small part of what's interesting. The outcome where we ended up in terms of how distinctive we are versus how kind of business school, generic business school we are, is an interesting question. But what the question I think is even more interesting, because perhaps I was so embedded in it, how did we get there? What were the conversations, the discussions? What was it about some conversations that pushed the result in one direction or the other? How did we come to a decision about what it meant for us to be optimally distinctive? And I think there's a big opportunity for this kind of, for more research into that question. How does this particular social object negotiated? How does it come about, that negotiation? So there's tons of them. We just saw Gino's stuff and some of the Paris stuff. There's lots of quantitative research looking at both what are the outcomes and what's the impact of those outcomes. What we don't have so much of yet is what's the process through which this happens and this is produced. And that's what I want to talk a little bit about today. I think it's interesting when I was looking at optimal, the literature and kind of reviewing it. I mean, I read some of it before, but as I said, this isn't my core area. And I think optimal distinctiveness, I think we can call it pretty accurately now, not a research area, but a research program. There's a whole bunch of people from different areas who've come together around this concept. People from categories, people from strategy, people from OT. We've had a big mixture of us on this panel, but I think it really now created what's pretty clearly a research program. And this research program has drawn on the methods and ideas and interests of institution theory, lots of stuff in entrepreneurship. How do you create an optimally distinctive organization? Institution theory, of course, lots of interesting stuff there about legitimacy versus distinctiveness. Cultural entrepreneurship, lots of stuff about how you do it. And that, I think, is the simplest place to deepen and encourage and develop even more insight into the how-to part of this. How does it happen? And I think the fact that it, as a research area, is bringing together institutional theory and strategy is in and of itself really interesting. But of course, the strategy as practice people have all kinds of interests about how this happens that can really be brought together with a bunch of institutional theory people like me who care about how institutions are built in language and in texts. And bringing those two sets of interests together, you get, I think, another way to look at optimal distinctiveness and some other new ways to deepen research into optimal distinctiveness. So what kind of things might be useful? Well, of course, in terms of qualitative methods, in institutional theory, discourse analysis has been incredibly useful. Understanding how social objects are constituted in texts, in sets of texts, has turned out to be quite a productive method in order to really understand how institutions come to be or how they're disassembled. or how they're shaped or how they're held in place. And I think there's great opportunities in optimal distinctiveness to apply some of those ideas to build on the kind of stuff that Steve McGuire, Cynthia Hardy, myself, various people have published around the discourse analysis and institutional theory. But of course, identities is another area that this clearly we can draw on well-established methods and lots of findings and stuff that we can use to further explore this optimal distinctiveness thing. And I think that the narrative studies and of identity and show us lots of great ways that we can apply these kind of things to understand how did the organizations get there. And I think it's really interesting to ask the question in the strategy making process that I was part of at the business school. It was explicitly about optimal distinctiveness. People said out loud, we need to be more the same as everybody else, or we need to be more different than everybody else. And I'd be really curious in other cases to what degree is this purposeful and part of the actual discussion, and to what degree is it an outcome that appears, but it wasn't actually intentional and it wasn't actors acting purposefully. And I'll come to that in a sec. And of course, rhetoric, I think, is also really, really useful and interesting. And I was trying to find papers on optimal distinctiveness and rhetoric. There's a few that you could kind of put in that box, but I think there's a lot of opportunities to do more stuff around that. And I think when I looked at this and was thinking about it and thinking about stuff that I've been working on for a while, I really think that there's a work perspective and looking at how people actually produce, how actors actually produce these outcomes is really exciting and interesting. And I think we look at, the kind of all the different kinds of work. We've proposed this social symbolic work perspective to kind of bring together the different kinds of work, all the different kinds of work, whether it's strategy work, identity work, boundary work, all the kinds of work that occurs both at the individual level in terms of constructing a self, at the organizational level in terms of constructing organizations and the parts of organizations, or at the institutional level, institutional work. Tom and Roy's concept, bringing those kind of tools together and integrating them to understand the production of optimal distinctiveness. Who's doing it? How are they doing it? And looking really not so much at the outcome as looking at the process and how actors do that, why they do that, to what extent they're doing it purposely and in an aware sense, or what extent they're trying to do something else and producing some version of distinctiveness as an outcome of other activities. So I think these really interesting, lots of really interesting possibilities to put these things together. As I mentioned, when I was looking at this and reading some of the papers and reading some of the papers for the first time, I was really struck by the way that this brings together all this work on strategy work and all this work on identity work in a really interesting way that I think there's a lot more potential to expand and develop those, bringing together those groups of scholars and the work that they've done, because this is really often, whether it's identity or a strategy or a product or an opera, people must be having arguments about to what degree is this a good idea and how do we convince each other whether or not we're going to do this and who has the ability to do that, who doesn't. So I think that's really interesting. If any of you are interested in this, Tom and I and a couple other folks have a special issue that's just been announced coming up in Journal of Management Studies. We'd love to have some optimal distinctiveness papers looking at it from this work perspective. So if any of you are interested in that, start thinking about how you might do that, what data you might use, or what theory you want to write about, because I think it would be a great fit with our special issue to have a paper in this area. Drawing on the kind of work stuff, because it's a special issue on work, forms of work, social symbolic work. But we certainly would be very interested and open to any kind of paper that kind of looked at how do actors work to produce things that are optimally distinctive. How does it work? What are the kinds of different objects, which could be, of course, an identity, could be a strategy, could be whatever you wanted to look at. But I think that would be a really interesting addition to the special issue. So if any of you find that piques your curiosity, we'd love to have you guys propose something, and maybe we can get a paper on this topic using these kind of methods, which would be fantastic. Anyway, that's all I want to say. I just wanted to make a pitch for qualitative methods, and particularly for work perspective, and just mention that if any of you have a paper, it'd be great if you sent it to us. All right. Thank you. Over to you, Eric.
All right. Yeah. Thank you so much, Nelson. I think I totally agree with you. there has been more quantitative studies in this area than qualitative research. So there's definitely a lot of opportunity in this space. And thank you so much for sharing this special issue opportunity. All right, so now we have about 30 minutes for a Q&A. I think I mentioned at the very beginning, we have a lot of people like registered for this PDW, but a lot of them didn't show up. But they did ask very good questions in the survey I did before the PDW. So I think some of them are still here. If you have some questions you would like to ask our panelists, please feel free to unmute yourself. And we would love to have a discussion here.
Eric, shall I jump in then?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Thank you so much, Joey.
Hey, so actually you reminded me just yet through a quick message about what I was reflecting on when I actually discovered quite late that I hadn't registered for the for the session yet. But I started thinking about something that I'm dealing with in I guess some of my own studies as well, which mostly lie at the product level. But I could easily imagine that this also sort of reflects back through other units of analysis as well. And that's mostly the issue of multidimensionality, right? Because usually what we look at is positioning in some kind of multidimensional space, right? Optimal distinctiveness, it's usually multidimensional, right? Different product features, for example, or different characteristics of a firm. And I guess what we've done in most work to date is, I guess at the end of the day, we end up with some kind of aggregate measure, right? We measure distinctiveness as some degree of deviation. However, these dimensions matter, right? Some dimensions might be more important in some cases as they are in others. For example, some organizations may pick out certain features to stand out in. Therefore, if they're more prevalent, maybe they're more interesting, yes or no. And QCA seems like something that could partially deal with this, but even then, there's so many features. So I sort of started wondering, okay, how do we deal with this inherent multidimensionality? Both in terms of how can we leverage this theoretically, as well as how do we avoid sort of falling in this trap of being overly tied to our empirical context, and then it will be very hard to sort of aggregate to something that makes theoretical sense. So I would like to, essentially it was simply the idea. I would like to see some views on this.
Yeah, I think this is a great question. This is essentially the question of the infinite dimensionality problem, right? So I you know this, I wrestled with this problem myself when I was writing the book, right? So I personally would also like to hear, what our panelists have to say on this question. It's a great point. Yeah. Anybody who would like to take this? Oh, Gino, can you unmute yourself?
Oh, sorry. Well, it's a great question. I think that Joe Porak, our Thomas and myself, actually, we talk a little bit about this issue in our SNJ paper. I mean, and the special issue that Rudy hosted. And I think it's one of the key problems. In a way, indirectly, when in my presentation, I was keeping this infinite dimensionality issue on the background. But so one tentative answer to the question is that the most obvious answer is that it depends on the audience, correct? I mean, there are certain product features that matter to a particular audience. So the idea would be to understand which audience you are considering, correct? But on the other hand, if you target a different audience, then there might be a different set of product features, and then which ones are really relevant. So to me, I mean, based on deep dive in the opera industry, if you compare and contrast critics and also opera goers, whether they're single ticket holders or even seasonal ticket holders, there are some underlying or product features that really matter when you go to the opera, whether you're a critic or not. So maybe whether the music, the performing, the interpreters, whether the but also whether you preserve the original script, and also whether or not you preserve the spatial and temporal coordinates, right? So, I mean, if you talk to people, not just critics, but also the producers and the opera goers, this is where the discourse actually revolves. So I think that clearly there are features that matter more to certain audiences than others, but the effort, if you are serious about the context, is to really engage in a conversation with different audiences, and then not just take the perspective of one particular audience and try to see whether there is a common set of attributes that are recurrent product features that different audiences talk about. So I think that is probably an empirical approach, less theoretical, but I think it makes sense because, I mean, our theories should be informed by the context at some level, correct? So I think that, in my opinion, I'm strongly advocating, obviously, quantitative research, especially what I like doing, but I strongly believe that a mixed method approach that Nelson Phillips was kind of referring to is absolutely necessary to study these very nuanced aspects. I mean, you cannot really make any significant statement about optimal distinctiveness unless you really understand the context. So qualitative research, whatever the form, is very important, and it should be seen as complementary, not as an alternative approach to quantitative research. So the two inform each other, but that's the only way to me to make an important statement in this respect.
Yeah, very good point, Gino. Any other takes on this question?
Eric?
Yeah.
I can offer something.
Sure.
Thanks. I agree with Gino. And interestingly, I studied the Atlanta Symphony Orchestra when the musicians went on strike over the non-tenurability of some of the musicians. And there you could see the real differences between the musicians and the administrators. And coming out of the strike, they wound up reprogramming some of the music that was offered in the concerts, which appalled the critics. They devastated them in their reviews to say, you can't have Beethoven and Bach in the same night. It destroys the musical canon, which they held sacred. So we didn't look at ticket holders, but we did look at critics. So in the same sense, I think it's who are your stakeholders, who are important to you in terms of the way that you frame yourself and where your sense of balance is. But I really want to question that notion of balance itself, because we've been saying you hold on to these two tensions simultaneously and try to find a middle path, perhaps a little conformity, a little distinctiveness, and chances are that doesn't work. So at one point or another, you're going to go up or down on that seesaw towards one or another. We also found it in cultural entrepreneurship, where the stories that entrepreneurs pitch to resource holders are ones of optimal distinctiveness, to conform to the institutional template, but to deviate from it. And so just a last comment is, I think it brings up a really important issue about that Joey had asked about, what do we pay attention to? And when you think about it, there's a lot of different things. This is a social symbolic, right? That go back to Meyer and Rowan, that there's a symbolic conformity that may appear to be resonating with what's expected, but there's something different about it. We also find, like when I did names, that organizations didn't conform to the current names, but they were aspirational about their future moves into a new industry sector and that kind of thing. So temporality in a different way is there, and the social symbolic may be different from the material moves they make or the cognitive ones. So thank you.
That's very good. Thank you so much, Marianne. And I think we have two more questions here. And Chen Jian, would you like to unmute and ask your question? Yeah.
Oh, thanks for the panelists for your wonderful insights. So my questions are directed to Marianne and Rudy about the temporality, because in the current literature, we see the sequencing model, from either being same then to be different, or to be different than the same. I'm wondering whether this could be managed at the same time simultaneously. You can do some coherence work, but also differentiation. This also relates to the first point, when there are different multidimensional aspects, then can this temporality could be managed simultaneously and then ultimately lead to optimal distribution, not just sequencing. So that is one more my question. And the second, I'm curious to know about whether the learning, the sense making, the understanding, reflecting part could be also optimal distribution process. It's not like in the end you reach the optimal distribution, but it's a process of learning, failing, try and error. Could this be learning, reflective, and experiment could be also part of optimal distinctiveness? Do you think optimal is a process, or is it like a final state of outcome? Yeah, that's my two questions. Thank you. And other panelists, if they have their points, I would also like to hear. Yeah.
Ariane, do you want to start? Or okay. So on the two questions, on the first question, I would encourage you just to perhaps, if I may, go to the paper we have in AMJ, where we separate conformity in two components with Pierre-Antoine Kremp, so 2016, and alignment. So interestingly, with Gino and Marianne, it's also about music, and because these are the symphonic orchestras in the US for a century that almost a century that we track and follow. And for alignment, we look at the repertoire and the repertoires for a given year, and we just calculate the difference, the average difference distance from the prototype of the year. And this is a moving, of course, we calculate this every year. And for conventionality, and this shows that actually it can be both aligned but unconventional, or conventional but misaligned, etc. What we do, we predict the features. So meaning the the composers of pieces that will be played the following year for a given orchestra. And so in a sense, it says what are the most conventional pieces. So Marianne was referring, for instance, to Bach or Beethoven. I mean, in the 30s, in the US, 30s and 40s, Mozart, for instance, was, I won't say completely absent, but was not at all what it became in the 50s and 60s, for instance, where there was kind of a renaissance for this composer. And so you have waves like this, where actually to be a philharmonic orchestra, you have to play, for instance, several pieces by Bach, but this doesn't prevent you from playing some other composers that are unknown or minor. And so at the same time, you could be conventional but misaligned. So I think that this is my answer to the first question. It's a methodological response. And for the second question, yeah, definitively, I think that this is the optimal distinctiveness is not a state, or it's a state in disequilibrium. So it's more kind of a process, and I think it's up to us to really understand what makes you be at a peak of the reg landscape, but this landscape keeps moving because, and this is the beauty of what we're studying, the different actors try to change the ruggedness of the landscape, just to take an advantage, to look for an advantage. So of course, if you'd like to connect optimal distinctiveness with local search, for instance, or NK modeling, or evolutionary theories about learning and adaptation, I mean, you're welcome, because you will shed light on the processes that lead to this unreachable and unstable optimal distinctiveness state.
Yeah, Marianne, do you have something to add, or we're good?
I could add two quick thoughts. I think Rudy covered it really well. This notion of time and sequencing, I think, is vitally important. I was talking about it either in terms of the organization's own history or the industry or market category in which they're embedded is really important. And part of that sequencing, I think, is to look at those transition points where the organization might flip from conformity to distinctiveness. And to your second question about sense making and all that, yes, it's important. I don't think we've teased it out at all. But I think that optimal distinctiveness is largely a social construction, which I think Nelson is pretty clearly articulating about how do we do this? What happens? What do we pay attention to? And all that is about sense making. So thank you for the question. Please pursue it in your research.
Eric, can I add something really quickly here? One thing, this is actually just a suggestion also for myself, actually. I'm not suggesting doing this to everybody except myself. But one thing that strikes me is that we always invoke this NK model landscape. But you need to understand that the NK modeling approach, it takes a reality that exogenous is out there. It's a given, right? So you adapt, you learn about an existing reality. Anyway, this is a very useful metaphor, if you wish, but I believe it would be very interesting probably for the future of optimal distinctiveness research, and not only for that purpose, is thinking about how you can shape the landscape, right? In other words, like for example, in the context of the opera industry, managing directors are trying to educate the public. So they are basically telling them that if we want to renew the opera, this is how we can renew it, right? Without altering or changing the very essence of opera, right? So which means that opera goers are part of this learning process themselves. So it's not that you are simply adapting and trying to understand what these people want and then you comply them with their requirements, correct? You try to conform to their expectation, you try to shape those expectations as well. And I believe that is an important consideration because really suggests the fruitfulness of looking at narratives, how you frame things, correct? So you can present things in different ways, although you don't change the product, correct? But you make people, the audience in this case, understand why you do certain things in a particular way. And that could actually eventually even reduce the heterogeneous responses to the same product offering, right? And therefore, even supposedly or seemingly heterogeneous audience might understand what you're trying to accomplish and to probably reduce also the infinite dimensionality problem. So I think that we should probably, I mean, I'm not advocating strong agency, but definitely we should acknowledge that there is more agency out there than sometimes our theory might assume, right? And so the landscape is not given, can be shaped to some extent. Yeah.
Right, that's a very good point. Thank you so much. I think you got the last question.
Okay, thank you so much. And I learned a lot from the session. It's the first time I attended the PDW, so I try to say something of substance. So my question is about the concept of legitimacy or Professor term. Maybe all the panelists or David DePaus, my teacher or a good friend, maybe can make some comment on this. Do we still have to talk about legitimacy? It's already pretty complex so far. So thank you.
Yeah, I have an answer, and I'm not sure it's completely satisfactory. So I share the same concern as you, that actually legitimacy has become a straitjacket. And so my way at dealing with it is just to follow papers by, for instance, Patrick Hack, Alex Bitetkin, Tost, 2011, about what they call legitimacy as judgment. So this stream of research represent legitimacy as a judgment, so as a perception, and has two dimensions. One they call validity, which is basically what you think others think about the assessment of the appropriateness of an entity. And so this is close to the meaning we often give to legitimacy. And the other one is what they call property, which is your personal account and assessment for the entity's appropriateness. And what I like about this is that it provides basically, first, it's audience centered. So it's very interesting for what we are talking today. So your question is a good question because it's a judgment. the second facet and the second interest is that actually it decomposes this judgment in two components, one that leads to a consensus and one that enables an individual to dissent. And so I think that there might be some fruitful research avenues for studying legitimacy as a judgment and not anymore as a macro concept, which suffers from some limitations, as you mentioned. I hope I was clear enough. I could.
More helpful, thanks.
Yeah, that's very good. Yeah, thank you so much. You know, I think we're running a little bit over time. I think that's okay because I've been really enjoying the questions as well as the answers. So let me just let's David. So you have something to say here? We do have time for you, definitely. Are you there still?
Yeah, legitimacy as perception is really a sort of a form of methodological individualism, which puts legitimacy down at the level of the individual making decisions about the moral appropriateness, and therefore sort of ducks the issue of what is the social system to which legitimacy or to which the entity is working in. So it's a nice sort of step in the process toward legitimacy, which in a sense is a collective could be construed as a collective concept from historical, sociological, and certainly from my perspective as a macro perspective. But as we know, it's built up by the micro foundations of individuals making perceptions. And so that's how these clusters, these groups, in some sense, the social system that surrounds the optimally distinct, the firm that's growing its optimal distinctiveness in various issues happen. So it's an interesting trade-off. I don't really actually consider legitimacy as perception, legitimacy per se, because legitimacy is something that's a property of societies, and society is more than just one individual, unless you're, a true methodological individualist, which I'm not sure I understand.
Thank you, David. Good to see you.
Yeah, that's very good, David. Thank you. So now let's move on to the breakout rooms. It's originally scheduled for 45 minutes, but I think we can just do 35 minutes. I think that's good enough, so that we have enough time for our second panel discussion. Okay, so I'm going to open all the rooms right now, and you can self-select into these different rooms based on your interests. Okay. If you have difficulty joining the room, let me know. I can move you there. Or you can just, put a room number ahead of your name, so I can pull you there as well.
Eric, just a quick question. To join my own breakout room, I have to click join myself.
Oh, right. Sorry. So let me share. Okay. It's my fault. So I think I should share the screen here so that there's different rooms. So these are the different rooms. We have 7 different rooms. Yeah. Yeah, I see a lot of you have already joined different rooms. Like I said, if you have difficulty joining yourself, just put a room number ahead of your name so that I can pull you there. All right, guys, welcome back. Yeah, thank you so much for staying with us. Let's see whether is Joanna here. Joanna, do you want to take it over and let's kick off the second panel discussion? Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, welcome back to the main room, everyone. I hope you had a great discussion. I joined some of the discussion rooms and personally find it very interesting and very encouraging. So thank you all to our panelists for leading the discussion. And thank you for the audience for being so enthusiastic and posting those questions. So now we are going to move on to our second half of the PDW. We will start with 7 distinguished panelists talking about some of the most contemporary and exciting topics related to OD that they are working on. And then we will follow with another Q&A session. Shall I? Maybe I could share my screen. So we will just go in alphabetic order this time. And then can you see my screen now?
Yeah, I can see it.
Okay. So Matt, do you want to take it over?
Sure. All right. Let's see here. Let me share my screen. Okay, can you guys see that?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Oh, hold on. Okay, that is sort of working. So hold on. Let's technical difficulties. Okay, that should be okay. All right. I want to talk a little bit about.
Hey Matt, sorry, I'm not seeing your screen for some reason. It's black.
Okay, hold on. Let me try again.
Matt,
yes. Hold on. I think. Hold on. Let me try one more time. Hold on. Swap displays. That's kind of going to work better. Okay, let me try again. Okay. Let me share this. Do you see a screen?
Yes.
Okay, and if I hit this, now do you see?
Yep. It works perfectly.
Okay, all right, thank you. All right. So, okay, with that, thank you guys for having me. I'm excited to talk about a little bit of nascent work that Cameron, myself, and some others are working on. So a lot of the work on OD in entrepreneurial markets, especially, has sort of looked at the product level, but for products that operate in one category. My own work in the Google Play App Store, an app is in one category, and that's all it is. But a lot of new entrants, a lot of products span multiple categories. And I think there are some unique implications of this on positioning strategies. So the first is reference points. So your number of multiple product categories, that really increases the number of potential reference points that you have to think about. So each category can have different sets of competitors, which may or may not be, they may be heterogeneous or homogeneous, which has impacts. Each category likely has one or more exemplar products, which may or may not be similar to each other. So now you have a bunch more exemplars. Each category can have its own prototypical member or members, so own prototype, which could potentially be different based on how you want to measure it. So there's a lot of potential reference points to think about. And so one of the questions becomes, well, how does the organization choose who to concentrate on? What's the most salient reference point? The second piece is something that was sort of mentioned earlier, and we talked about in our breakout room, is multidimensionality, right? Well, there are a lot of ways to signal distinctiveness, especially with products that span categories. One is the category memberships themselves. So instead of being in one category, if you're in products in 4, 5, or 6 categories, right, that could signal you're similar in a categorical way. It could be product features, which I know a lot of work has looked at. Maybe you're similar on features, but different on categories. It could be product descriptions, which is what I focused on. So maybe what's core, important about a product. And an organization can use all of these or more ways to signal that they're similar or different from other competitors. And so we might get to the idea that a product can share product categories with an exemplar and then use the description and features to distinguish themselves as somehow as different. So the example I want to quickly give is from the board game industry. So again, this is some work that Cameron and I and others have started to work on. So here's an example of a brand new game. It's called Europa Universalis. And as you can see the picture here, it's an extremely complicated game. There's a whole lot going on. There's cards, there's dice, There's a map of Europe. There's tokens. There's a lot of things happening here. So in regards to the reference points, right, this game happens to be in 11 different categories. And you can see the list of the categories here in black. And these are the top ranked games that's selected in these categories. So this is not an exhaustive list of exemplars, but a list of some of them. And you can see, for example, Twilight Imperium shows up 4 times. So maybe that becomes a salient game for this new game. Whereas you have, a game in the video game theme category called Mechs and Minions, which is likely quite different from a game about sort of overtaking medieval Europe. So I think you have a lot of potential reference points here, which may or may not matter to the developer. And so in the multidimensionality side of this, right, this game has a lot of different levers they can pull, right? So they have the categories. They're in 11 different categories. They have 7 different game mechanisms, right? So product features. So, action points, majority, influence, movement, card-driven, dice rolling, hand management, scenario. So a lot of different product features which may be allowed, they may be able to distinguish themselves or not on. And of course, they have the game description, which is sort of hinting at some of the context of the game and highlighting some of the key features. And there's more. This is just sort of a general overview of some of these things. But the question becomes, which of these is more important for optimal distinctiveness? Can you be distinct on some, different on others? This is how you may be able to achieve this? What is the outcome? Is it audience attention? Is it sort of evaluation? So your game is good or not? Is it eventually sales? So I think there's a lot of opportunity here. And this is just something that Cameron and I and others have been working on. And so if you're interested, it's from the Board Game Geek website, and you can go and take a look at it. And that's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Matt. Very interesting talk on optimal positioning strategies in market entry. Thank you again. And then we'll move on to Richard. Would you like to share your screen?
Yeah, I think.
Matt, you got to stop sharing yours.
I thought I did. Hold on. My Zoom messed up, and I don't know. Oh, there it is. All right. Thank you. All right.
Okay, let me share mine. So now it should be visible, right?
Yes.
Great. Okay, I'll also try to keep it brief. Also, given the nature of the roundtable that I was on, I'll just share some reflections on potential use cases for machine learning approaches for optimal distinctiveness research. So I'm Richard Haans. I'm at the Erasmus University Rotterdam. And kind of the theme of my talk, if you will, is finding the right hammer in terms of methods for this optimal distinctiveness literature. I use this analogy of hammer and nails because, as you probably also know, new methods can really have quite substantial impact on management research and specific fields. And especially recent years, you see a lot of large-scale text-based data sources emerging and also being used in this stream of literature. And alongside of those, you also see a lot of new methods developing. And in particular, in recent years, you see a lot of machine learning approaches coming up and emerging. There's many options available to do machine learning. It's a broad class of methods. And one thing I always find very striking is they tend to be quite easy to use. It's very easy quite often to run a machine learning model, but it's especially difficult to really master them because they're so black boxed. So basically what I'm trying to do in these 5 minutes or so is to help make sense of the complexity of these machine learning approaches that you could take. So these are just 2 pictures from 2 papers talking about specifically text analysis in political science. And here you see all these complicated flow charts of given a specific research objective, there's different machine learning approaches that might be useful and that can be used. So basically, I want to just give my initial answer on the question of which of these tools are particularly relevant for optimal distinctiveness research. There's many out there, I think, but in the interest of time, I'll just flag 2. The first being topic modeling. That's been my hammer for a few years now, Just to summarize very briefly the intuition behind topic modeling, basically you start with a collection of text. So these could be firm self-descriptions, right, from websites. That's what I've been working with. Could be product descriptions, could be basically any text. And what it does, it tries to find the terms that are frequently used together. So they classify those as topics. They get aggregated into topics. So you get an overview of topics in a text, but also the individual text gets assigned to topics. So you load more or less on specific topics. This is a method that has been used quite substantially in management research, enough to warrant a full review. And also specifically in optimal distinctiveness, there's already been some work published. There's been my own, but also in recent years, others have been applying topic modeling in optimal distinctiveness. And the way people tend to do it is as shown here. Basically, you have, in my case, website data. So how do firms talk about their own activities? You apply this topic modeling method, you get the topics, and then you can see, does a firm emphasize more or less the central topics in a given field? So are you different in what you emphasize compared to others in your field, in your market, when you talk about what you do? And I think a key benefit of topic modeling compared to some of the other archival data approaches in optimal distinctiveness is that you identify the ways in which firms differentiate themselves in a more inductive, data-driven way. So the topics that you see here, those are the words you see here, those come from the data. So these are the ways in which firms tend to talk about themselves in a systematic way. So I think that's pretty attractive, given that a lot of the archival work tends to rely on rather far removed, proxies for positioning. And this really comes straight from the data. You could also conceptualize these topics as being representative of the central tendencies in a field, or maybe the norms. So you could get new insights about what are the norms in a market category. And you can also apply then those measures in a subsequent step where you could perhaps try to cluster similar organizations into groups, right? More in this tradition of strategic groups research, but building on very multidimensional data, rather than needing to rely on, for example, SIC codes, which we all know are quite crude. So these are just some ways that I think topic modeling specifically can be relevant for optimal distinctiveness. Another one is what they call word embedding models. That's a more recent development in the field. And basically it's a relational model of words. It can also be a relational model of documents. But basically the intuition is that words that are similar in their context will be positioned nearby to each other in vector space. This method is very new. It's much less established, but it's really very, very quickly emerging. So there's some published work out there in different fields, but also as a reviewer, I notice a lot of work is introducing this specific approach in the field of optimal distinctiveness. And basically what it does is it's similar in nature, I think, to topic modeling, but it's slightly different in the methodological setup. But basically you can also identify pair firms in a given firm. So this is just something I found online. The link to this will be in the notes of the slides, which I guess will be shared. But here you can see, okay, Black Forest Bakery is very closely positioned in this term space to several other bakeries. So this is a way intuitively that you could also apply this method to optimal distinctiveness. How different do you want to be from close peers or maybe from the overall market? Compared to topic modeling, this is even more multidimensional and fine-grained in nature because this really works with individual terms in order to get the distance measures. So it's really very, very multidimensional. And I think a very unique benefit of word embedding models is that they can be used to solve analogy problems. So if you start out with the term king and you subtract the vector for the term man and you add the vector for the term woman, the nearest word that would pop up would be queen. So I think that's quite an interesting thing to think about how that could inform optimal distinctiveness research. So for example, you could start from, you have a very clear exemplar in mind, say Apple, when you think about smartphones, and you want to find out what the exemplar is in another market. You could also apply this kind of analogical reasoning. So maybe Apple minus smartphone plus cars would lead to Tesla. So I think this is a method that can lead to a very different setup in terms of thinking about how do we identify, positions or specific types of firms to which then other firms could be compared. Just very brief, but just to conclude, these are two out of many, many possible options. I personally think these two are high potential for optimal distinctiveness. But by and large, I would say machine learning can really inform optimal distinctiveness research in many different ways. I've just flagged a few, right? It could maybe make the norms and the central tendencies of a field much more explicit than we would otherwise be able to do. It can identify the dimensions in which the organizations differentiate in a more inductive way, so a much more context-informed way. It can help us grapple with multidimensionality, something that's come up several times already today, I think, in the sense that these are extremely multidimensional models. You identify hundreds of dimensions along which firms differentiate. But at the same time, for example, by moving towards topics, you also then reduce this dimensionality in rather meaningful ways. And it can inform, I think, new ways of grouping organizations or members of categories compared to the approaches that we've been taking so far. You can account for multi-category membership, you can account for nesting structures, etc. So I think new methodological approaches can lead to new insights for these streams of literature. A word of caution, of course, I got 5 minutes, so I can't go into all the detailed nuances, but each of these models, of course, requires very deep understanding of the assumptions that you make when you run these models and how they think about how language works. So there's the review paper out there showing just some of the steps that you need to think about if you want to apply these models. But basically what I want to kind of conclude with is that I think it's very worthwhile for optimal distinctiveness scholars to consider expanding the methodological tool set to include maybe machine learning as a way of studying optimal distinctiveness. Thank you so much for your attention.
All right, thank you, Richard, for sharing your expertise on machine learning and specifically on topic modeling, word embedding. It's absolutely very powerful and fascinating methods, and also for sharing how these connects back to the theoretical concerns about multidimensionality. I've learned a lot personally. So next we'll move on to Jade and Eunice. Please take your floor.
Okay, hello everyone. My name is Eunice Reeve from Seattle University, and today I'm presenting jointly with Jade Lowe. So we have 10 minutes altogether because we have several projects that we're working on together. So what we've decided to do in this time is to share some of the projects that we're working on in light of optimal distinctiveness, and also will relate it to what Per has presented earlier on category of viability. So we'll focus some of the common themes across the studies that we're going to share is that both external distinctiveness, which is how a category relates to other categories within a given system, and internal coherence, the category specific meaning coherence, both matter in optimal distinctiveness, and also how a firm can coordinate multiple dimensions of resources to potentially reach that optimal distinctiveness, and also consider some audience heterogeneity. So the first study we're going to share is about edutainment. If you grew up in the US in the early 1980s and 1990s, you probably know that during that time, this was a pretty hot category. The main finding or main takeaway from this study is that all firms were being very intentional and focusing on their own strategic categorization, which eventually led to the category decline because there was no optimal distinctiveness whatsoever. First of all, there was low coherence within the category because the category promoters who were just using the category label, which was a hot category, by active strategic categorization, they didn't do any gatekeeping at the same time. And those who were actually the real edutainment companies, they actively dissociated from the category. They just lost the category. But however, the media picked up these firms as the category exemplars, even more confusing the audience in terms of the category meaning. And because this was a very hot category, there was a lot of entrants from different product backgrounds, such as toy, media, books, and so on. So it had a very low distinctiveness. So this is an example of a lack of, there was intentionality, but lack of reaching that optimal distinctiveness, which have led to the category decline. The next study we want to share talks more about the multidimensionality and how firms can coordinate different resources and features to reach that optimal distinctiveness. So this is a case that we're studying on the emergence of plant-based meat. And we believe that in this case, the firms have been working really hard on achieving both a medium level distinctiveness and a medium level coherence. So in terms of coherence, they have both sides. They are really low in terms of what the actual category or what meat means in this case, but they still have a very high coherence in terms of their plant-based meat category identity. In terms of distinctiveness, I think this is more interesting in terms of how they position the category within the entire category system, is because they're pretty low in terms of distinctiveness when it comes to the plant-based meat resemblance to traditional meat. So they mimic the appearance, taste, packaging, and the practice of shopping experience, but they still remain really high in terms of the health, sustainability, and other aspects. So we believe this is a good example of how firms can actually orchestrate different elements or different dimensions of the resources, and this balancing act really helped this category become mostly a substitute to the traditional meat. And the final example I'll be sharing, then I'll be handing it over to Jade, is more focused on audience heterogeneity. And we're particularly interested in there can be differences even within the same audience group. So we're studying the vegan restaurants and how the veganness of the restaurant in terms of how they position them and the audience's vegan identity work together to influence the evaluation. So we scrape Yelp data to see the audience's identity in terms of how vegan they are, and also look at the restaurants in terms of their veganness, in terms of their naming, menu positioning, and so on. And what we see here is that the value congruence between the audience and the restaurant influences the evaluation more positively, even though this used to be a very, very distinctive and very coherent category. There's some room to maneuver in terms of that positioning. So that was a very quick overview of the 3 studies, and I'll hand it over to Jade, who will talk more about a more recent study that we're working on and some theoretical implications and future research agenda.
All right, thank you, Eunice. So Joanna, please let me know when I have 2 minutes left. Thank you. So yeah, so as Eunice said, we've been working on a couple of empirical studies, broadly drawn the idea of internal coherence and externally distinctiveness. And this is another example that Eunice and I, we are currently working on with Jeff Subleri at HEC Montreal. So we collected a large amount of data on Kickstarter. And so on Kickstarter, we know that there are over 100 of subcategories. So there are some basic level categories, and under each basic level category, there are multiple subcategories, right? So we look at 170 categories over the window of 11 years and track their viability. So here viability referring mainly is defined as the usefulness of a category on this platform. And we look at how the viability of each category change over time. And we look at it as a function of both the internal coherence of each category and externally how it is positioned in relation to other related categories. So here, this is just a graphic illustration example from our data. And it's interesting how Matthew earlier touched upon the table game. So it is, okay, this is something about how popular this category is. So among all the gaming categories, you can see that the table games, tabletop game categories kind of pick up and remain very viable over the past decade or so, whereas some other games, the video games, mobile games, although they are still there on this platform, they were not as useful or viable in terms of how we define it. And then what we found primarily is that the viability of a category kind of has a, so in terms of internal heterogeneity, there is an inverted U-shaped relationship between internal heterogeneity and the viability of a category. But then whether that the shape is inverted U or U, then it's actually contingent upon the external, the distinctiveness dimension that the categories is situated within the broader classification system. We won't have time to get into the details of the papers, but across all 4 empirical papers that Eunice and I have presented so far, we saw there are a couple of theoretical insights that are worth mentioning. So first, we wanted to think about the problem of OD, not at firm level, but also at the category level. Because for every category, they also have this similar problem at, you need to be optimally, distinctive in comparison to other competing categories in any system. So we wanted to highlight this relational view of categories. And then also another thing we think it is important to think about the whole concept of OD is that I think this also corresponds to the opening introduction that Eric had, and also Marianne's insight, which is this is a dynamic concept. And exactly good because all of the actors are trying to change or to achieve OD. So that means that the whole system may be changing from time to time. And so what's optimal at some point will quickly maybe shifting at some other point. So it is interesting to trace the longitudinal dynamic evolution of each category over time. And then lastly, we also want to echo Rudy's and also Gino's presentation and the importance of considering audience heterogeneity. So audiences are different. What is optimal for one audience may not be so for the other. And so sometimes then even firms themselves can be a type of audiences. What's legitimacy among the firms may not be so among certain audiences. So we thought this provided a lot of interesting opportunities for future research. So Eunice, yeah, thank you. So more concretely, when we think about the future research questions, we think some important questions to ask include, so basically given the relational nature of categories, how do developments or changes in one category affect products, their viability or their legitimacy in other categories? And also given the interconnectiveness among categories, then how can firms or how should they think about how to strategically position themselves or change their positions, not just within the focal categories, but also think broader, think of across the set of related categories. And then also given this thing, another important topic in today's PDW is the concept of multidimensionality. A couple of panelists have already touched upon this. But then, yes, given all this, how do we determine the most relevant dimensions which to focus our attention on? And also, in light of this audience heterogeneity both within and across categories, how should firms position themselves? How to determine what's the most relevant audience group or audience class segment for a particular firm? What's your target audience may not be mine, right? And so how to manipulate that? And finally, we also think about the dynamic nature, not in terms of the categories or firm's positioning, but also audience change. So audience taste, their interests, their goals may also be dynamic, changing over time. And how does that affect firms' positioning? And next slide, please. Thank you. So in terms of methodological considerations, and I'm thankful that Richard earlier touched upon this topic as well. I think it is important to find, yes, it is important to find the right hammer for our questions. So, and in Eric's latest book, they also mentioned that some of the latest tools in this realm of machine learning can be helpful. Indeed, especially in light of this multidimensionality thing issue. We agreed that topic modeling machine learning could be helpful, and that is also the method that the paper Eunice and JF and we are currently working on. We use topic modeling in that study. And in order to capture audience heterogeneity, we also think that it's not just the type of hammer or tools that we use matter, but also the sources or the ingredients. Okay, so that by ingredients, we refer to the source of data that can be useful to think about. So in order to capture different tastes of different audience groups, it might be useful to think about alternative data sources. For example, the social media, different blogs. Oftentimes, even for the same type of product category, you can find multiple different online communities, and each of the communities may have their own unique norms, values, and their preferences. So that's something else to think about. And finally, we wanted to go back to this old but good method, which is experiments. So especially given the cross-level nature of the OD, initially it was actually a very micro level, individual level concept, and now we shifted to the firm level and even category levels. Actually, with a lot of changing variables, actually experiment can be good to pinpoint to the precise mechanisms. That is, you fix a lot of other moving dimensions, but then you look at just one thing or one level. And also experiments can be powerful when you want to manipulate audiences' perceptions or their, you can prompt a specific set of values in the audience by using experiment design. So, I mean, I think our time is up, but thanks for this opportunity to share.
Excellent, thanks, Eunice and Jade. Great talk, very informative. And thanks for covering both like theoretical and methodological front on contemporary OD research. And next, we'll move on to Majid. Please feel free to share your slides.
All right, you can hear me well and see the slides? Okay. Hi, everyone. Thanks a lot for inviting me here and giving me the time to be here. I'm super excited to present very briefly a project that Eric and I have been working on. It's great to go after Jade. One of the questions that they asked and finished, the question we ask is whether firms should differentiate or conform to various benchmarks in those categories that they belong to. So, for example, if you're thinking about optimal positioning strategy for this book, Thinking Fast and Slow, we'll look at which category it belongs to, which in this case, it's psychology, cognition, and memory. And then we ask how it should conform or differentiate to different benchmarks on different dimensions. But if you think about it, there are so many different ways that each one of us would shelf this book in our personal libraries, right? In fact, if you go to goodreads.com for this book, there are about 22,000 at the time of this, when I took this screenshot, 22,000 different ways that people had shelved or categorized this book, right? And there is a lot of research that explains why this happens. People categorize objects differently based on their prior knowledge and expertise, different goals and motivations, etc. Now, why does this matter? Because the category that a firm, the way an audience categorizes a firm or a product determines the evaluation criteria that is applied and the reference group that is compared against. So if the Thinking Fast and Slow is categorized as leadership business, it might be compared with Who Moved My Cheese. If it's categorized as thinking philosophy, compared against being and time. Two very different benchmarks. And it's only reasonable to assume that the outcome of those evaluations are going to be different. So you are going to have people who have a more favorable predisposition toward the product or the firm, and people who have less favorable or unfavorable predisposition toward it. And then the question is, how should firms position themselves given such heterogeneity, such idiosyncrasy within the audiences. And the answer that we provide here is that firms could gain higher evaluation, higher performance outcomes, given such heterogeneity, to the extent that they gain an audience composition premium. Or in another word, to the extent that they are able to gain attention and coverage from the audiences who have a favorable predisposition toward them, and less attention and coverage from audiences who have an unfavorable predisposition toward them. And this is where that machine learning aspect comes into play, because machine learning could be used very reliably, at least in context that you have good data, to predict those type of predispositions that each individual audience might have toward the firm. And then the firms could use such predictions to position strategically such that they gain attention mostly from those with a favorable predisposition. So what we do in our study is that we grab the security analyst investment recommendation data. We implement a machine learning model. It's under the class of recommender systems. It's a really cool method. It's the same family of models that Amazon, for example, uses to predict what are your preferences and suggest the product to you, or Netflix uses to predict your predispositions and preferences, recommends shows to you. And the model works pretty well. We quantify how well it works, but also here a visualization. One axis you have the predicted recommendations, one axis you have the observed actual recommendations, and this is for a test set which was held out during implementing the model. So the model didn't have access to this data, but you can see that it did a pretty good job in making those predictions. And then we use these predictions to operationalize our construct of audience composition premium. We show that it's actually a significant, important predictor of the actual investment recommendations that firms had garnered. So I just want to make two key takeaway points here. One is that we really need to, as it was mentioned multiple times in this PDW, we need to incorporate that the role of the heterogeneity, the idiosyncrasy in audiences and their the evaluation schema that they use, the categorization models that they use. And when trying to do that, or when trying to empirically measure that, machine learning is a really powerful tool. That's the core strength of machine learning, to discover those patterns hidden in the data and to make reliable predictions. Thank you very much. I hope it's a conversation starter for in the future, and just thank you for giving me the time.
Thank you so much, Majid, for your presentation. Very insightful presentation on machine learning and how to use the predictive power to shed new lights on audience heterogeneity and other theoretical issues. Thanks again. And then we will have Cameron presenting.
Okay, can everyone see my screen?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, perfect. So first and foremost, thanks to Eric and Joanna for organizing this. I think this is consistently one of the most interesting PDWs that at least I attend at Academy every year. So it's great to be here. It's an honor. I'm going to talk about some really broad ideas that I think might be interesting opportunities in OD, and then give a very sort of quick example, which I think is actually pretty interesting, that sort of contextualizes what I'm talking about. So the general question that I'm sort of interested in is, how might optimal distinctiveness manifest in craft-based industries or cultural production markets, right? And those aren't necessarily always the same thing, but I consider them markets where this, the social construction of markets plays sort of a prominent role, where identity, either organizational or collective, reputation, social evaluations, authenticity are pretty much as important as any objective marker of underlying quality, right? They include craft beer, organic food, coffee, chocolate, food trucks, underground supper clubs, outsider art, music, and they may include any other number of other industries. But these are the types of sort of industries that I think are interesting and potentially fruitful for looking at optimal distinctiveness, right? And the reason for that is they're unique in certain aspects, right? So in craft industries, often the very act of standing out or being distinctive is an explicit attempt to fit into the collective identity of the industry or the category. So what does that mean for our traditional sort of conceptualization of this tension between fitting in and standing out, right? Additionally, organizations may try to position themselves or be as distinct as possible from other cognitive reference outside of the industry, right? Typically, we think of it as being positioning yourself within the industry vis-a-vis these cognitive reference, right? And this is particularly the case in what I call oppositional markets, right? Where the most relevant cognitive reference are often sort of incumbents or mass producers in the mainstream market, as opposed to, you know, whatever we want to look at, whether it be prototypes or exemplars within the focal industry, right? So these are different ways that I think that craft industries may be unique and offer sort of some interesting sort of counterpoints to what we know about optimal distinctiveness. We see this in the craft beer industry, which is an industry that I've been particularly interested in, done some work in, right? So you see this oppositional nature in sort of the rhetoric and the identity of these breweries. So you have Rogue, we never intended to get big. You have agrarian ales, which they actually say, you know, intentional variations. So this goes against sort of the consistency of what you get from sort of mass producers. And then Sam Adams saying, you know, brewed inefficiently since 1984, which I think is from a traditional strategic perspective, not necessarily what you would want to say. But again, they're saying this, right? I want to highlight sort of Rogue, which I think highlights this, what I think is really interesting, this paradox of growth in craft industries and how it may relate to optimal distinctiveness, right? So Rogue is a craft brewery from Oregon that was one of sort of the original breweries in the Pacific Northwest, sort of one of the OGs, if you will. It's consistently ranked as one of the 50 largest craft breweries in the country, first to export internationally to Japan over 20 years ago, exports to 55 different countries, but yet consistently they tried to sort of highlight this notion that they're just another brewery, right? They're just one of the gang. They never wanted to get big. They didn't actually want to grow, which I think speaks a lot to sort of this idea of authenticity and sort of moral authenticity about, you know, you don't have these you don't value extrinsic rewards. It's more intrinsic value, right? And the beer that really drove that growth was a beer called Dead Guy Ale. Now, this is a really highly rated, world-class beer, according to experts. So what would traditional strategic management logic say? Well, it would suggest that you sort of leverage all of your resources and take advantage of this hit beer. If you have a hit product, then you really want to sort of, particularly as an entrepreneurial firm, you want to leverage all your resources to be able to sort of take advantage of that and scale production, right? But instead, as Dead Guy Ale was becoming so popular, right at the time it started hitting sort of national prominence, they decided, this was about 10 years ago, they decided to sell and produce another beer called Voodoo Donut Bacon Maple Porter, right? And it is basically exactly like it sounds. It's infused with bacon and maple syrup. I don't know if anyone has tried this beer before, but it is objectively terrible. I mean, it is a really, really, really bad beer. And that's not just my personal opinion, right? So if you look at Beer Advocate, which is one of the leading rating sites, here you have Rogue has about 150 beers that have been rated. The Bacon Maple Ale has gotten over 1,600 reviews, and it's consistently one of the lowest rated beers that that Rogue produces, right? So okay, you made your point, right? Like you have shown that you are thinking out of the box and you've shown your credibility as a craft brewery. So what do? What you should probably do is you should turn your attention back to Dead Guy Ale, right? And start scaling production on that. But that's actually not what Rogue does, even though they're creating this terrible beer. They wear this like a badge of honor, right? This distinctiveness like a badge of honor. And moving forward, not only did they continue to produce that beer, they produced another one with chocolate, peanut butter, and banana. They produced one with pretzel, raspberry, and chocolate. a lemon chiffon flavored beer, a grape flavored beer, and one of my personal favorites, one that's infused with sriracha. All equally bad. Like if you look at the ratings, these are all sort of their lowest rated beers from a quality perspective, right? And so what's the takeaway from this? What can we learn, particularly as it relates to sort of optimal distinctiveness within the context of craft markets, right? I think it actually speaks to sort of Rudy's point about what is the optimal point? I mean, you have these industries where there is maybe no optimal point. There's no limit to how distinctive that you can be. And so how can we understand optimal distinctiveness? How can we understand balance? How can we understand the tension when there is literally no reference on how distinctive you can optimally be, right? And I think for me, at least, that leads to sort of some lingering, interesting questions that we may be able to sort of move forward with, you know, again, at least for me, right? Like how does optimal distinctiveness square with perceptions of authenticity in craft markets? For example, exemplars. Some of these exemplars in the craft beer market are often derided as selling out, right? So how does this coincide with the way that we view exemplars in other industries, right? What can OD teach us in markets where distinctiveness is already the North Star, right? It's the guiding principle and one of the foundational components of the collective identity of the market. In oppositional markets, how does positioning vis-a-vis cognitive reference within the category versus cognitive reference in adjacent mainstream markets? And then finally, can firms leverage some of their products to fit in while simultaneously leveraging other products for the sole purpose of standing out and hewing closely to the collective identity of the process? So that was just sort of an example and hopefully some fodder for some interesting ideas and conversations moving forward. Thank you very much. I'll leave you guys with a quote that I think actually sort of fits with both this notion of the paradox of growth, but also sort of this tension in OD. One of my favorite quotes. So I always like to add that in. Thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Cameron. Very fascinating research context and interesting ideas relating to the authenticity of craft beers. And last but not the least, we have Shannon presenting. Shannon, please take the floor.
Okay, thanks y'all. This has been so fun, and being mindful of time, I'm gonna land this plane really quickly. So hold on to your hats. I wanted to take this notion of where I think optimal distinctiveness research can go from a very high level. So I think it ties in a lot of what we have been talking about today. It obviously touches on sort of my provenance as a scholar, with nods certainly to Marianne, and also with regard to what is sort of my methodological home, which is qualitative methods. So specifically, I would like to focus on this notion of sociocognition within optimal distinctiveness. I think of this as interpretation and evaluation of certain actions and behaviors, whether those be at the firm level, at the organizational level, at the individual level, in light of the broader organizational environment. And so what this results in is shared development of meaning and understanding, which is obviously incredibly important to what we do in the optimal distinctiveness world, because optimal distinctiveness ultimately lies at what I would say sort of the nexus of multiple things. So it lies at this notion of temporality. So the dynamics moving forward within markets, broader environments, even what's happening more internally within organizations, cognitive reference, which I will dive into more, and audiences. Obviously, this is not an exhaustive list, but these are the three that I would like to put forth today as potential avenues for future research. And as you can see, many of them echo what has been spoken about earlier today. When we think about cognitive reference, I think this is where qualitative research can really come into play, because what is important here to understand is that these are the most salient others in the market. So that can take place in terms of particular organizations or in terms of institutionalized elements as we think about prototypes, these abstracted notions or characteristics of what is most important here. But the thing that we need to qualitatively get at is why these matter, and and why certain cognitive reference are so important in the optimal distinctiveness literature, namely that these are the most salient in the minds of their audiences. And the ways to best find that out are to qualitatively see what are the ones that continually keep coming up as the exemplar organizations, or for these new firms, who are they continually sort of referencing as they're developing their own identities, their own narratives, their own products, whatever it might be. We know that cognitive reference matter for a number of different reasons. I'm not going to go through all of them here, but ultimately they help prime audience classification and sense making, which ties into that notion of audiences. And we've seen that cognitive reference play oftentimes some sort of an implicit role in optimal distinctiveness, as we saw early on in Eric's definition of optimal distinctiveness. There was no real clear definition of what we are being legitimate to or conforming to or different from. And here are a number of different quotes from literature in this space that suggest that it might be from institutionalized conventions, from their organizational peers, from exemplars, from other organizations. So I would like to urge scholars moving forward to be very explicit about what cognitive reference are being used in the optimal distinctiveness literature as you are sort of diving into this, and why these are important and appropriate given the stage of the market, the theoretical lens being applied, and ultimately the audience's understanding and evaluations of optimal distinctiveness. Secondly, I want to dive more into that notion of audiences. Obviously, optimal distinctiveness is an evaluation conferred by audiences. They are willing to give an outsized amount of support, resources, whatever it might be, to those organizations that are deemed optimally distinct. So there's been conversation today around which audiences matter, whether these shift over time. I would like to see more in the qualitative space about how these audiences are part of those OD processes, how they create those criteria for and make evaluations of optimal distinctiveness, potentially how evaluations or expectations for optimal distinctiveness are co-created by the organizations that are doing so and audiences, which gets really at that temporal component, that dynamic nature of optimal distinctiveness. So I would like more work to be done to consider how audiences can be included in really meaningful ways in optimal distinctiveness literature to expand our interpretive, explanatory, and predictive powers of what these ventures are doing. And ultimately, we know that temporality has been incredibly important to optimal distinctiveness literature. There has been this more recent pull towards optimal distinctiveness as being dynamic and complex, and that invokes a lot of what's happening within those broader social changing environments. So how are these processes developed and managed, considering the optimal distinctiveness over time, the expectations that audiences have for that over time, and when do cognitive reference used by audiences change, right? So is that dependent upon category evaluation, by audience type? What makes these cognitive reference maybe more salient at one point in time versus another? And part of this also gets at that notion of potentially having cognitive reference at different levels. So maybe you are looking to certain cognitive reference within your market versus externally, and when those cognitive reference can change over time. But ultimately, I think a lot of what I'm touching on here is how can we construct optimal distinctiveness? What power do certain individuals or groups have to influence this nature and to shape what it looks like, especially over time as we continue to see optimal distinctiveness from a really dynamic space? Okay, that's it. Thanks.
Thanks, Shannon, for sharing this a lot of future research directions, which also brings our PDW to an end. I would like to quickly wrap up as we are running out of time. So first and foremost, I'd like to express my appreciation to all the panelists for donating your time and wisdom. Without your input, this PDW would not have been such rich and interactive as it has. So please join me in giving them a big round of applause. And then I'd like to say thank you all to all of our participants for spending time with us and for asking valuable questions. And as we have known from Eric, this is the first PDW on OD at the AOM. We are seeing a proliferation of research in the past few years, And we hope that this PDW will continue to move this conversation forward. And we hope you to continue working on those exciting research opportunities pointed to by these panelists, both on theoretical and on methodological front, to continue to advance our understanding of OD and to move this conversation beyond. So with that, I think this is the end of this session. And thank you so much for coming again. And please be well and stay healthy. And we hope to meet you in person in future events. Thank you.
Thank you and Eric, of course. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks to you. Thanks to you, Eric, and you, Joanna.
Thanks, everyone.
course,
Thanks for organizing.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Yeah, see you. Enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you so much. Great.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Eric and Joanna.
Yeah. Good to see you, Marjit.
Good seeing you.